The desert has a way of stripping a man down to his most basic elements until there is nothing left but the mission and the memory of what he is fighting for. I stood on the edge of the perimeter at Forward Operating Base Echo, the dust of the Levant clogging my lungs and the sun beating down like a physical weight on my shoulders. As a captain in the United States Army specializing in human intelligence, my entire professional existence was predicated on the identification of anomalies. I was trained to look at a crowded marketplace and see the one man whose breathing was too shallow or the one vehicle sitting too low on its suspension. I dealt in the currency of secrets, and I was very good at my job. But as I stared at the grainy image of my daughter on the tablet screen, the diagnostic software in my brain began to scream. The satellite delay was 3 seconds, a lifetime when you are trying to catch the truth in a child's eyes. Lily was sitting in our sun-drenched kitchen in North Carolina, but she looked like she was trapped in a bunker. Her posture was rigid, her spine pressed against the back of the chair as if she were trying to disappear into the wood. Behind her stood Isabella, my second wife, the woman who had appeared like a miracle in the wake of my first wife's sudden passing. Isabella's hand was resting on Lily's shoulder, her fingers manicured to a sharp, porcelain perfection. To anyone else, it was a gesture of maternal comfort. To me, it looked like a high-pressure grip on a sensitive trigger. I watched Lily's eyes. They were darting toward the periphery, tracking Isabella's movements with a hypervigilance that was entirely unnatural for an 8-year-old. I noticed the way she swallowed, a hard, painful movement that suggested a throat constricted by fear. This was tactical suppression. Someone was controlling the narrative on the other side of that camera. I looked at the financial data I had been reviewing before the call, the subtle drain on our joint accounts, the redirected allotments, the strange payments to offshore pharmaceutical wholesalers. The numbers didn't lie even when the people did. Isabella smiled into the camera, a radiant, practiced expression that reached her eyes but didn't warm them. She spoke of the upcoming Easter holiday and the traditions we were missing. She spoke of the peace of the household and the growth of the garden. But as she talked, I saw a flicker of movement in the background. A shadow moved across the hallway, and Lily's hand began to shake. It was a tremor of the 4th and 5th digits, a classic sign of neurological stress or chemical interference. I ended the call with a steady voice, promising to see them soon, but the moment the screen went black, I was already dialing a secure line to a private contractor in the States. I needed an asset on the ground who wasn't bound by the slow-moving machinery of the JAG Corps or the bureaucratic red tape of the CID. I needed someone who could move through the shadows of suburbia with the same lethality I moved through the mountains of the Hindu Kush. I called Miller, a former ranger who ran a high-end investigative firm specializing in internal threats. I told him to put the Waverly Drive property under 24-hour technical surveillance. I wanted the phone lines tapped, the Wi-Fi intercepted, and a full forensic audit of Isabella's history before she ever stepped foot into my life. If you have ever felt that cold, sinking realization that the person you trust most is actually your greatest enemy, you know exactly why I couldn't wait another second to act. The flight back to the States was a blur of C-130 engine hum and the metallic taste of adrenaline. I didn't file a travel plan with the family. I didn't send a text. I arrived in North Carolina under the cover of a civilian identity, checking into a low-rent motel that sat just outside the signal range of my own home's smart security system. Miller was waiting for me in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and cheap coffee. He laid out the dossier like a map of a minefield. Isabella wasn't a saint. She was a professional. She was a biological insurgent who specialized in the long-term destabilization of wealthy families. The data was staggering. 3 previous marriages, 3 untimely deaths, and 3 massive insurance payouts that had been laundered through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. She didn't use guns or knives. She used chemistry. She used the slow, invisible lethality of potassium imbalances and heart medications that mimicked natural failure. I looked at the photos Miller had taken of my daughter during his surveillance. In one shot, Lily was standing by the trash cans, her face bruised and her eyes hollow. In another, she was being forced to drink something from a dark blue glass while Isabella held her jaw tight. The rage was a physical thing, a burning sensation in my chest that threatened to override my tactical training. But a captain doesn't charge into an ambush. A captain waits for the optimal window of engagement. Miller handed me a small, high-tech transmitter disguised as a dog tag. He had managed to swap it onto our golden retriever's collar during a brief window when the dog was left in the backyard. The tag contained a pinhole camera and a directional microphone. I opened the laptop and synced the feed. The image flickered to life, showing the interior of my own living room from a dog's eye view. I watched as Isabella walked across the hardwood floors, her movements sharp and aggressive. She wasn't the soft, grieving widow I had married. She was a predator in a silk robe. She kicked the dog aside when he got too close, a casual act of cruelty that made my blood run cold. Then, I heard the sound of Lily crying in the upstairs bedroom. Isabella stopped, her head tilting like a bird of prey. She began to climb the stairs, and I felt the walls of the motel room closing in on me. I had to get inside that house. I had to become the ghost that Isabella never saw coming. I prepared my gear with the methodical precision of a man preparing for a night raid. I checked the suppressed sidearm, the zip ties, and the recording devices. But the most important piece of equipment was the one thing Isabella expected to see in the house on Easter morning. I pulled the heavy, oversized Easter bunny suit from its box. It was a ridiculous, plush costume with a frozen, manic grin. To a child, it was a symbol of joy. To a killer, it was a perfect camouflage. I would enter my own home as a mascot of the holiday, a silent observer hidden behind a mask of faux fur and polyester. I moved through the neighborhood with the practiced silence of a reconnaissance specialist. I knew the blind spots of the streetlights and the timing of the neighbor's porch lamps. I reached the back door of the basement and used the manual override I had installed years ago. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of Isabella's expensive perfume and the underlying metallic tang of fear. I slipped into the suit, the interior becoming a hot, humid tomb as I pulled the rabbit head into place. The world was reduced to the narrow slats of the mesh eye holes. I climbed the basement stairs, every floorboard a potential alarm. I reached the kitchen and saw the evidence of Isabella's work. A vial of clear liquid sat on the counter next to a glass of water. A notebook was open, filled with calculations of dosages and body weights. This wasn't a home, it was a laboratory of domestic homicide. I moved toward the hallway, the giant, padded feet of the suit muffling my footsteps. I could hear Isabella's voice coming from the top of the stairs. She was talking to Lily, her tone a low, terrifying snarl that sent shivers down my spine. If you have ever seen a person reveal their true colors like this, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone in realizing how thin the mask of civilization really is. I stood in the shadows of the foyer, a 6-foot-tall rabbit holding a recording device, as the woman I had sworn to protect and cherish began to threaten the life of my only child. The dialogue was a confession in real time, a verbal roadmap of the murders she had committed and the one she was currently planning. I realized then that I wasn't just there to save Lily. I was there to be the final witness to a reign of terror that had spanned a decade and 3 states. Isabella was standing at the bedroom door, her back to the stairs. She was telling Lily that if she breathed a word about the bruises or the medication, the dog would end up like her mother. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. She was admitting to the murder of my first wife, Sarah. She was gloating about the brilliance of her own design. I felt the weight of the sidearm against my hip, but I knew that a bullet was too quick for a woman like this. She needed to be dismantled. She needed to watch her entire world of lies crumble under the weight of the truth. I stepped out from the shadows and onto the first step of the staircase. The wood groaned under the weight of the suit. Isabella froze. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood perfectly still, her shoulders tensing as she processed the sound of an intruder in her sanitized sanctuary. I didn't say a word. I just waited. I wanted her to feel the presence of the judgment that was coming for her. I wanted her to look into the glass eyes of the rabbit and see the reflection of her own soul. When she finally turned, the scream died in her throat. The sight of a giant, silent rabbit standing in the dim light of the hallway was a psychological shock that broke her composure instantly. She stumbled back, her hand reaching for the doorframe for support. I began to ascend the stairs, one heavy, deliberate step at a time. The rabbit's grin remained fixed, a permanent expression of mockery as the woman who thought she was the smartest person in the room began to realize she was the prey. I reached the landing and stood before her. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting toward the kitchen where she had left her phone and her chemicals. I reached up and pulled the rabbit head off, revealing the face of the husband she thought was 5,000 miles away. The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed her face was the only gift I needed this Easter. The mission was no longer about observation. It was about extraction. And as I looked past her into the eyes of my trembling daughter, I knew that the next few minutes would change the course of our lives forever. The silence that followed was a vacuum of sound, a high-altitude pressure that made the ears pop and the heart hammer against the ribs like a trapped bird. Isabella's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air on a dry dock, as she looked from my face to the plush, severed head of the rabbit in my hand. Her psychological profile suggested a woman who thrived on the predictable, a technician of human emotion who only operated when she held the high ground. Seeing me standing there, a ghost in camouflage and polyester, was a catastrophic system failure for her. I watched the cognitive dissonance play out across her features, the denial, the calculation, and finally, the cold, hard realization that the predator had been the one under surveillance. I didn't give her the luxury of a verbal opening. In interrogation, the first person to speak usually loses the initiative. I simply stepped into her personal space, the sheer mass of my frame forcing her to retreat toward the master bedroom. Behind her, Lily was a statue of frozen trauma, her small hands white-knuckled as she gripped the doorframe. I could see the fresh, yellow-green bruising on my daughter's collarbone where the high-necked sweater had shifted. It was a visual confirmation of the forensic data Miller had provided, a physical receipt for the cruelty I had allowed into this house. My internal moral compass was spinning wildly, but my tactical training kept my hand steady on the rabbit head, my eyes locked on Isabella's jugular. She finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing that lacked its usual synthetic sweetness. She asked how I was there, her words tripping over themselves as she tried to reconstruct her facade of the concerned, grieving wife. She tried to move toward Lily, reaching out a hand in a simulated gesture of protection, but I moved with a sudden, violent economy of motion. I caught her wrist in a C-clamp grip, my thumb pressing into the radial nerve until her fingers flared open and she let out a sharp, jagged hiss of pain. It was the same grip I used on high-value targets in the Levant. A non-lethal but absolute assertion of physical dominance. I told her to stay away from the child, my voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the family photos on the hallway walls. I pulled a small digital recorder from the hidden pocket of the bunny suit and pressed the play button. The hallway was suddenly filled with the sound of her own voice from 10 minutes prior, the snarl, the threat about the dog, the casual admission of what she had done to Sarah. The recording was high fidelity, capturing the exact cadence of her sociopathy. Isabella went pale, the color draining from her face until she looked like the marble statue she so admired. She looked at the recorder as if it were a live grenade, and in a legal sense, it was exactly that. The pivot happened in a heartbeat. When a narcissist realizes the mask is unsalvageable, they don't repent, they incinerate the evidence. Isabella lunged not for me, but for the glass of water she had left on the nightstand in our bedroom, the one I now realized was spiked with a lethal concentration of her chemical inventory. She wasn't trying to hide it, she was trying to ensure there were no witnesses left to testify. I pivoted on my lead foot, a standard defensive maneuver, and intercepted her before she could reach the door. I threw her back against the hallway wall with a controlled force that sent a framed print of our wedding day crashing to the floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds of irony. If you have ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you realized you were in the presence of pure, calculated evil, hit the like button because that instinct is the only thing that keeps us alive in a world of wolves. I stood over her, the weight of the last 18 months of suspicion and grief coalescing into a single point of focused intent. I told her that the police were already 3 minutes out, that Miller had the house surrounded, and that the Saint of Fayetteville was about to become the lead story on every news cycle from here to the coast. I watched her eyes dart to the window, measuring the drop to the driveway, her mind already seeking the next exit strategy in a life built on escapes. I reached behind me and pulled Lily into the safety of my shadow, never taking my eyes off the woman on the floor. I whispered for Lily to go to the basement, to find the hidden room where Cooper was waiting. My daughter didn't hesitate, she knew the sound of a command that meant survival. As her small footsteps faded down the stairs, I turned my full attention back to the insurgent in my bedroom. Isabella had stopped crying. The fake tears had dried instantly, replaced by a cold, flat stare that was devoid of any human empathy. She sat up, smoothing her hair with a terrifying nonchalance, and asked me what I thought I was going to prove. She began to lecture me on the fallibility of digital evidence and the loyalty of the local community. She reminded me of her charity work, her standing with the general's wife, and the way she had curated a public image of domestic perfection. She was betting on the believability gap, the idea that a decorated officer in a bunny suit would look like a psychotic break while she looked like the victim of a military-grade meltdown. It was a sophisticated defense, a psychological counterinsurgency designed to make me doubt my own eyes. But she had forgotten one critical detail of my training: I never go into a target building without a secondary reconnaissance feed. I reached into the plush ear of the rabbit head and pulled out a microscopic camera lens, showing her the live uplink to Miller's server. I explained that every second of her vitamin routine with Lily, every threat she had uttered, and every chemical she had mixed had been broadcast in real time to a secure off-site location. The knowledge gap she had relied on was gone. She was no longer the one holding the secrets, she was the one being exposed. Her hands began to shake then. A genuine neurological tremor that no amount of acting could suppress. The Predator was finally realizing that the cage doors had been locked from the outside. I walked to the closet and pulled out her travel bag, the one she kept packed for her emergency trips to visit her non-existent sick aunt. I threw it at her feet and told her to start talking about Sarah. I wanted the technical details. The dosages, the timing, the way she had manipulated the civilian doctors into ignoring the potassium spikes. I needed the confession for the record, but more than that, I needed to hear her say it. I needed to hear the monster admit to the crime so that I could finally bury the guilt of not being home to protect my wife. Isabella looked at the bag, then at me, and a slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. She told me that Sarah had been easy. She described the process with the clinical detachment of a lab technician, explaining how the digitalis had been masked by the herbal teas she had encouraged Sarah to drink for her migraines. She spoke of the way Sarah had looked at her with gratitude as she handed her the final, lethal dose. It was a psychological assault, a deliberate attempt to wound me in the one place my armor couldn't reach. She was trying to provoke a violent response, hoping I would strike her and give her a claim of physical abuse to muddy the waters of the upcoming trial. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the urge to end the conversation with a single, decisive blow. But I remained a statue. I was a captain, and this was an extraction, not a street fight. I heard the distant wail of sirens, the high-pitched shriek of local law enforcement responding to Miller's active intruder call. Isabella heard it too. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine, uncalculated panic. She scrambled toward the bathroom, likely intending to flush the remaining vials down the toilet, but I was faster. I blocked the door, my arm a solid bar of muscle that she couldn't move. I told her that the plumbing had already been diverted into a holding tank Miller had rigged in the crawlspace. We had the evidence, we had the audio, and we had the witness. The front door burst open downstairs, the sound of heavy boots echoing through the foyer. I didn't move. I stayed in the doorway, the rabbit head at my feet like a trophy of a hunt. I watched as the local police swarmed the landing, their weapons drawn, their faces a mix of confusion and intensity. I raised my hands slowly, identifying myself by rank and serial number, while Isabella began to scream, throwing herself onto the floor and claiming I had tried to kill her. It was a final, desperate performance, a masterclass in manipulation that would have worked on anyone who hadn't seen the raw footage. One of the officers, a man I had coached in Little League before my last tour, looked from the disheveled woman on the floor to the giant bunny suit I was wearing. He looked at the digital recorder in my hand and the cold, dead certainty in my eyes. He didn't arrest me. He walked over to Isabella, pulled her arms behind her back, and clicked the stainless steel cuffs into place. The sound of the ratchets was the most beautiful music I had heard in 2 years. It was the sound of a perimeter finally being secured. It was the sound of the war coming to an end. As they led her away, Isabella turned her head and hissed a final curse at me, a string of profanities that stripped away the last of her saint persona. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I watched her go, a small, broken figure in a silk robe, being escorted out of the house she had tried to turn into a tomb. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I had won the battle, but the landscape of my life was a scorched earth. I turned toward the basement stairs, ready to find my daughter and begin the long, slow process of rebuilding a home from the ruins of a crime scene. The basement was a cathedral of shadows, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and the stale scent of long-buried secrets. I moved down the wooden stairs, the plush bunny feet of the costume feeling heavy and clumsy on the steps, a stark contrast to the tactical precision of the last 10 minutes. I found Lily in the small, reinforced gear room I had built behind the furnace. She was sitting on a pile of rucksacks, her arms wrapped tightly around Cooper, whose tail gave a single, rhythmic thump against the floor. The dog looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. A mirror of the trauma reflected in my daughter's face. I knelt in the dust, the white fur of the suit staining gray, and simply held them both. The silence of the house above us was absolute, a structural peace that felt fragile and unearned. I knew the paperwork trail would be a mountain of technicalities, statements to the CID, depositions for the district attorney, and the inevitable internal reviews that come when a field officer goes off reservation. But as I sat there in the dark, I wasn't thinking about the military justice system or the forensic toxicology reports. I was thinking about the way Lily's breathing was finally beginning to level out, the jagged gasps of a cornered animal being replaced by the steady rhythm of a child who finally felt the perimeter was secure. We stayed like that for a long time, 3 survivors of a domestic insurgency, waiting for the world to stop spinning. Miller arrived 20 minutes later, his heavy boots clumping on the floorboards above before he descended into the basement. He didn't say a word as he handed me a bottle of water and a clean flannel shirt he'd pulled from my go-bag. He looked at Lily and the dog, then at the discarded rabbit head sitting on the concrete floor like a hollowed-out skull. He gave me a sharp, professional nod, the universal signal between operators that the objective had been neutralized. He had the digital recordings backed up to 3 separate servers and a team of private security detail waiting at the end of the driveway to ensure the house remained a sterile site. The extraction was complete, but the occupation of our new reality was just beginning. If you've ever looked at your own life and realized the floor you were standing on was actually a trapdoor, hit the like button because the moment of realization is often more dangerous than the fall itself. I spent the next 4 hours walking the local police through the technical infrastructure of Isabella's deception. I showed them the hidden compartments in the pantry where she kept the concentrated digitalis, the burner phones she used to contact the gray market pharmacies, and the ledger of vitamins she had been forcing into Lily's system. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall that would keep her away from us forever, but each one also felt like a fresh wound. A reminder of the vigilance I had failed to maintain while I was chasing ghosts in the desert. By dawn, the house was empty of everyone but the three of us. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the early morning breeze, a garish ribbon across the front porch. I stood in the kitchen, the sun hitting the very spot where Isabella had mixed her poisons, and I felt a profound sense of territorial reclamation. I began the process of decontaminating our lives. I threw away every glass, every bottle of tea, and every supplement container in the house. I scrubbed the counters until my hands were raw, as if physical friction could erase the chemical residue of her presence. Lily watched me from the doorway, Cooper at her side, and I realized that the healing wouldn't come from a bottle or a doctor, it would come from the restoration of the routine. I took Lily to the beach that afternoon, driving 3 hours east until the suburban suffocations of Fayetteville were replaced by the salt spray of the Atlantic. We didn't talk about the bunny suit or the sirens or the woman who was currently being processed into a state holding cell. We talked about the tide. We talked about the way the seagulls could hover in the wind without moving their wings. I watched her run across the dunes, the wind whipping through her hair, and for the first time in 18 months, I didn't see the hypervigilance in her eyes. I saw a child who was beginning to trust the horizon again. The war had cost us Sarah, and it had nearly cost us our sanity, but it hadn't taken our ability to stand in the light. The legal fallout was a surgical operation that lasted nearly a year. Isabella's defense team tried to play the PTSD card, suggesting my military service had made me an unreliable witness and a violent husband. They tried to suppress the audio recordings, citing privacy laws and technicalities in the surveillance warrants Miller had obtained. But they couldn't explain the potassium levels in Sarah's exhumed tissue. They couldn't explain why 3 other men in 3 different states had died with the exact same chemical signature in their blood. The Saint of Fayetteville was dismantled piece by piece, her history of systemic homicide laid bare for a jury that looked at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. I sat in that courtroom every day, a silent sentinel in my classy uniform. I wanted her to feel the weight of the state and the weight of my gaze. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, including the first-degree murder of my wife, I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I felt the closing of a file. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright North Carolina sun, the air tasting like freedom. I had fulfilled my final mission for Sarah. I had brought her killer to justice and secured the safety of our daughter. But as I reached my car, I saw Miller leaning against the fender, his face grim, holding a folder that hadn't been part of the trial evidence. He told me that Isabella hadn't been working alone. He had traced the offshore payments not to a bank, but to a private military contractor's slush fund, the same company that had handled the logistics for my unit's last deployment. The realization was a cold spike of ice in my gut. This wasn't just a serial killer with a penchant for husbands, this was a targeted operation. Isabella had been placed in my path. She had known my deployment schedule, my financial status, and my daughter's vulnerabilities because someone on the inside had sold her the blueprint. The knowledge gap I thought I had closed was suddenly yawning wide again, revealing a deeper, more professional layer of betrayal. I took the folder from Miller, the weight of it feeling like a new weapon in my hand. I looked at the names of the board members, the list of retired officers who ran the firm, and the familiar logo of the company that had provided our intelligence in the Levant. The conspiracy was a sprawling, sophisticated machine, and I was just one man with a recording and a bunny suit. But they had made a tactical error. They had targeted my heart, and they had left me alive to respond. I looked at Miller and told him to get the team back together. We weren't going home. We were going back on the offensive. The domestic front was just the beginning. If you've ever realized that the person you were fighting was just a foot soldier for a much larger enemy, hit the like button because that's when the real game begins. I spent the next month living out of motels again, moving Lily from safe house to safe house while Miller and I began the deep tissue reconnaissance on the contractor. We found the links. The accidental deaths of 4 other officers in my battalion, all of whom had been investigating discrepancies in the unit's procurement accounts. Each man had left behind a widow who had been comforted by a friend from the base chapel. It was a business model built on grief and insurance fraud, a high-stakes liquidation of military assets. I realized then that my return in the bunny suit hadn't just interrupted a murder, it had tripped a silent alarm in a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Isabella was the leak they couldn't plug, and now that she was behind bars, they would be looking to cauterize the wound. I started sleeping with my sidearm under my pillow again, the familiar weight a comfort in the shifting shadows of the safe houses. I taught Lily how to check the perimeters, how to identify tails in traffic, and how to use the encrypted comms. I was turning my daughter into a survivalist because the world had proven that being a good girl wasn't enough to keep you alive. We were staying in a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains when the first attempt came. It wasn't a loud entry, it was a professional, low-signature probe. I saw the IR glint from a night vision optic in the tree line 300 yards out. I didn't panic. I woke Lily and moved her to the pre-designated hot room in the cellar. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the cabin with the silence of a man who had hunted in these mountains long before he ever wore a uniform. I reached for the tactical vest I kept near the door, the ceramic plates heavy and reassuring against my chest. The rabbit was gone. The captain was back in the wire. I waited until the lead element reached the porch. I could hear the faint scuff of saws on the wood, the rhythmic breathing of a man who knew his business. I didn't use a firearm, I didn't want the noise to alert the secondary team in the woods. I used a high-tension wire and the darkness of the foyer. The takedown was silent and absolute. As the man went down, I stripped the comms from his ear and listened to the chatter. They were using my old unit's call signs. They were using the same tactical protocols I had helped write. They weren't just contractors, they were brothers in arms who had sold their souls for a piece of the payout. I spoke into the radio, my voice a flat, dead tone that cut through the chatter like a knife. I told them I knew who they were, I knew who was paying them, and I knew exactly where their families slept at night. The silence on the other end was the sound of a tactical retreat. They knew I wasn't a victim they could bully, I was a peer who knew their every move before they made it. I watched from the window as the IR glints faded back into the forest, the professional predators realizing they had cornered a man who had nothing left to lose and a daughter who was watching his back. The war wasn't coming, the war was already here. The cabin was silent again, but it was the silence of a loaded chamber. I stood in the dark, the captured radio still humming with static in my palm, and looked at the man lying at my feet. He was wearing high-end tactical gear, sterile of any unit patches or identifying markers, but the way he carried his kit told me everything. He was a veteran of the same specialized reconnaissance groups I had once led. These were men who had been taught to blend into the shadows of a foreign city, now applying those same skills to a mountain ridge in Virginia. I didn't feel a sense of betrayal, I felt a sense of clarity. The enemy was no longer a ghost in a bunny suit or a sociopathic wife, the enemy was a reflection of myself. I moved to the cellar and tapped 3 times on the heavy oak door. Lily opened it, her eyes wide but her hand steady on the small emergency satchel I had taught her to pack. She didn't ask if I was okay. She looked at the gear I was wearing and the radio in my hand and understood the status of the perimeter. We had 12 minutes before the secondary team realized their lead element had gone dark. I didn't want a firefight in a confined space with a child present. I needed to move. We exited through the rear utility tunnel I had dug out 3 months prior. A narrow, dirt-walled crawl space that emptied into a dense thicket of rhododendrons 100 yards from the cabin. The night air was freezing, but the adrenaline kept the cold at bay. We moved with a rhythmic, low-profile gait, keeping the ridgeline between us and the cabin. I had a secondary vehicle cached in a dilapidated barn 2 miles down the logging road, a nondescript, reinforced truck with a high-gain satellite uplink and enough fuel to get us to the coast. As we ran, I realized that the knowledge gap was the only weapon that mattered now. They knew where I was, but they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that Miller had already decrypted the first layer of the contractor's server, revealing a network of medical consultants who had been facilitating these domestic liquidations for years. If you've ever had to leave everything behind in the middle of the night because the world you trusted turned into a hunting ground, hit the like button so I know the survival instinct is still alive out there. We reached the barn just as the first flares began to light up the sky over the cabin. They were burning it down. It was a standard sanitization protocol: destroy the evidence, erase the scene, and claim it was a tragic accident involving a disturbed veteran. I watched the orange glow against the clouds and felt a grim satisfaction. Let them think I was inside. Let them report the death of Captain Elias Thorne. I was much more dangerous as a dead man than I ever was as a living one. The drive toward the coast was a lesson in tactical patience. I avoided the interstates, sticking to the backroads and the logging trails where the license plate readers couldn't track our movement. Lily slept in the passenger seat, her head resting against the door, while I listened to the encrypted chatter on the satellite phone. Miller was already in position at a secure facility in the Outer Banks, a decommissioned coastal monitoring station that provided the perfect offshore platform for our counteroffensive. We arrived at dawn, the gray Atlantic churning with a violent, winter energy that matched the state of my mind. The facility was a concrete fortress, half buried in the sand and salt spray. Miller met us at the heavy steel gate, his face a map of exhaustion and focus. He had been working the digital front while I was in the mountains, and the news wasn't good. The contractor, a firm called Aegis Solstice, had already moved to freeze my military pension and my bank accounts, using a series of fabricated national security warrants. They were trying to starve me out, to cut off my logistics before I could go public. But they had forgotten one thing: a man who has spent 18 months in a combat zone doesn't need a bank account to survive. He needs a mission. We moved into the command center, a room filled with the hum of servers and the blue glow of monitors. Miller showed me the kill chain, the documented process Isabella and the others used to identify targets. They looked for officers with high insurance policies, young children, and wives who were already struggling with the isolation of military life. They didn't just kill, they replaced. They embedded their own assets into the families, creating a self-sustaining cycle of fraud and control. And at the center of it all was a name I hadn't heard in years: Colonel Marcus Vance. My former commanding officer. The man who had given me my first commission. The betrayal was a jagged piece of shrapnel in my heart. Vance had been a mentor, a man I had trusted with my life and the lives of my men. To see his signature on the authorization forms for Isabella's deployment into my life was a trauma deeper than any I had faced in the desert. He had sold me out for a percentage of the payout. He had watched me grieve for Sarah, knowing all along that he had ordered the hit. I felt the bunny suit's fixed, manic grin hovering in my mind again. A mockery of the honor I had believed in. I turned to Miller and told him to bypass the legal channels. This wasn't a case for a jury anymore. This was a direct action. We spent the next 48 hours mapping Vance's movements. He lived in a sprawling estate outside of Arlington, a fortress of high-end security and political connections. He thought he was untouchable behind the shield of his rank and his company's influence. But he hadn't accounted for the rabbit. He hadn't accounted for a man who was willing to dress in a plush costume and haunt a house to save his daughter. I began to build a plan that wouldn't just expose him, it would destroy the entire infrastructure of Aegis Solstice from the inside out. I needed a way to get into his secure server, and I knew exactly who held the key. Isabella was still in the county jail, awaiting transfer to a federal facility. She was the weak link in Vance's chain. She was the one who knew the passwords, the protocols, and the locations of the physical ledgers. I needed to get to her before Vance's cleaners did. I knew the jail's layout, it was a standard design I had studied during my training. I also knew that the transport would be the most vulnerable moment. I looked at Miller and told him we were going back to Fayetteville. We were going to hijack a federal prisoner transport, and we were going to do it in broad daylight. The risk was astronomical. If I was caught, I would be branded a terrorist, a rogue operative who had finally snapped. I would lose Lily forever. But if I didn't act, Vance would win. He would continue to harvest the lives of soldiers, and eventually, he would find us in whatever safe house we tried to hide in. I looked at Lily, who was sitting at a terminal, watching the security feeds Miller had pulled up. She looked at me and gave a small, determined nod. She knew the stakes. She was the daughter of a captain, and she was ready for the final phase of the operation. We moved out at midnight, the coastal station falling away in the rearview mirror. I felt a strange sense of peace as we approached the city. The tactical variables were locked, the mission parameters were clear, and for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting for a country or a flag. I was fighting for the truth. We reached the outskirts of Fayetteville just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long, golden light over the town where my life had been dismantled. I looked at the gear in the back of the truck, the uniforms, the masks, and the heavy, white fur of the bunny suit. If you have ever had to play the villain to finally find the justice you were denied, hit the like button because sometimes the only way to save the world is to burn the parts of it that are already rotten. I checked the suppressed rifle one last time, the click of the magazine seeding a final, definitive sound. We took our positions at the intersection near the courthouse, the same spot where Isabella had been arrested months ago. The transport van was scheduled to pass through at 8 o'clock. I pulled the rabbit head over my face, the mesh eyes narrowing as I focused on the road ahead. The bunny was back, and this time, he wasn't looking for eggs. He was looking for blood. The intersection was a grid of cold asphalt and calculated timing, the morning commute a slow-moving river of unsuspecting civilians. I stood behind the brick pillar of an old textile mill, the heavy rabbit head a stifling furnace in the humid Carolina morning. To any passerby, I was a local promotion or a prankster gone too far, but through the mesh eyes, I was tracking the thermal signatures of the approaching convoy. Miller was 3 blocks north in a hijacked utility truck, ready to trigger the signal jammers that would turn the transport's GPS into a blind, spinning compass. I felt the weight of the flashbangs against my ribs, the metal cold and certain. This wasn't just an extraction. It was a decapitation strike against the narrative Vance had built. The transport van rounded the corner at 8:02, flanked by 2 nondescript sedans that screamed private security detail. These weren't county deputies, these were Aegis Solstice contractors. I stepped into the crosswalk, a 6-foot-tall mascot of absurdity, and stopped. The lead driver slammed on his brakes, the screech of tires a violent tear in the morning quiet. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for a remote detonator. I didn't blow the van, I blew the transformer on the utility pole behind them, a shower of blue sparks and white noise that shorted out every electronic sensor within a 100-yard radius. The street went dead, the silence rushing back in like a flood. Before the contractors could exit their vehicles, Miller's truck slammed into the rear sedan, a controlled kinetic impact that pinned it against a parked bus. I moved toward the van's side door, the plush bunny feet sliding over the asphalt with a ghostly quiet. I slammed a magnetic breaching charge against the lock. A muffled thud, a cloud of gray dust, and the door hung open on a single hinge. Isabella was inside, bolted to the floor in a belly chain and leg irons. She looked at the rabbit mask, and for the first time, her eyes didn't show calculation. They showed a raw, primal realization that the ghosts she had created had finally come to claim their due. I dragged her out by the chains, the metal clattering against the pavement as Miller provided cover with a suppressed rifle, pinning the remaining contractors behind their engine blocks. I didn't speak. I shoved her into the back of our waiting truck where Lily sat with the satellite uplink ready. Isabella began to babble, her voice a frantic stream of deals and threats, until I pulled off the mask and leaned into her personal space. I told her that Vance had already authorized her liquidation, that the transport wasn't taking her to a federal facility, but to a disposal site. I showed her the intercepted orders on the tablet, the attempted escape protocol that would have ended with her in a shallow grave. The betrayal shattered her. A narcissist cannot survive being the pawn, and as we sped away from the chaos of the intersection, she began to vomit the secrets of Aegis Solstice into our recording devices. She gave us the decryption keys for the Blue Ledger, the offshore account that funded the domestic hits. She gave us the names of the 3 senators who were on Vance's payroll. She gave us the location of the server farm where the raw footage of every murder was stored as blackmail material. If you've ever seen a person realize they are the smallest fish in a very dark pond, hit the like button because that's the moment the hunter truly becomes the hunted. We reached the Outer Banks facility by midnight, the air thick with the smell of salt and the impending storm. We didn't wait for a trial. We didn't wait for the slow, grinding gears of the JAG core. We uploaded the Blue Ledger to every major news outlet, every military oversight committee, and every private intelligence network on the globe simultaneously. We watched as the digital forest fire began to spread, the stock price of Aegis Solstice plummeting in real time as the world saw the faces of the soldiers they had liquidated for profit. The knowledge gap was gone. The shadows had been burned away by 1,000 flickering screens. Vance was arrested 4 hours later in his estate, the FBI and CID finally forced to act by the sheer volume of public evidence. He didn't go quietly, he tried to reach for a sidearm, but his own security detail, realizing the ship was sinking, held him down for the federal agents. I watched the live feed of his arrest from the command center, Lily's hand in mine. He looked at the camera as he was being led away, his face a mask of cold fury, and I knew he was looking for me. But I wasn't there. I was a dead man, a ghost in a bunny suit, a memory of a captain who had refused to die in the desert. The aftermath was a cleansing fire. Aegis Solstice was dismantled, its assets seized, and its board of directors indicted on charges ranging from wire fraud to capital murder. The military began a full-spectrum audit of its private contracts, a process that would take years to complete but would finally protect the men and women still in the wire. Isabella was transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility, where she would spend the rest of her days surrounded by the walls she had built for others. The Black Widow was finally caught in her own web, a prisoner of the silence she had used as a weapon. I took Lily back to the small cottage on the coast, the yellow crime scene tape of our old life a distant memory. We didn't bring the bunny suit. We left it in the salt air of the monitoring station. A discarded skin of a life we no longer needed to lead. We stood on the deck as the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, the waves a rhythmic, healing pulse against the shore. I looked at my daughter, her face finally free of the shadows, and I knew that the mission was truly over. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the authors of our own future, a family built on the truth that had been forged in the dark. Justice isn't a destination, it's a constant state of vigilance. I still check the perimeters every night. I still sleep with a sidearm near the bed. But I also wake up to the sound of Lily laughing at the dog as they run along the surf. We lost Sarah, and we lost the innocence of our old lives, but we gained a clarity that most people never find. We know exactly who we are, and we know exactly what we are willing to do to protect the people we love. The world is still full of wolves, but the wolves now know that there is a rabbit in the tall grass who isn't afraid to bite back. If you've followed this story to the end, if you've felt the weight of the betrayal and the heat of the justice, I want to thank you for being the witnesses I needed. Your attention is the final layer of security that keeps people like Vance in the light where they can't hide. We are staying here, on the edge of the world, watching the horizon and living every day with the intent that Sarah would have wanted for us. The war is over, the reconnaissance is complete, and for the first time in my life, the only orders I have to follow are the ones that lead to a quiet, peaceful morning. I watched Lily pick up a seashell, her eyes bright with a curiosity that had been nearly extinguished. I realized then that the greatest victory wasn't the arrest of a colonel or the collapse of a corporation. It was the fact that my daughter could still find beauty in a world that had tried so hard to show her only the ugly. I picked up the camera one last time, not for surveillance, but to capture a moment of peace. The frame was perfect, a girl, a dog, and a rising sun. The captain was finally off duty. The mission was a success. And as the credits of our old life finally rolled, the screen went black, leaving only the sound of the ocean and the promise of a long, quiet day.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.